Dear friends, I think we should not wait for the 15 minutes, the academic 15 minutes, although you look a lot of you look like you're still on high school and university, which is very nice. Let me welcome you on this workshop, and this workshop with a few very excellent speakers, and I hope a very excellent audience, that will deal with trade. And trade, that is something very special, and at the same time it's something so very common. We've had trade, or we did trade, for more than 10,000 years in our societies, buying goods from another place and services because we didn't have them for ourselves. And it was a lot of the time part of a very important economic system that we had. And it also was there to feed in the cultural diversity, and it also always was a part of trying to keep peace in many of our societies. Because many nation states, at the moment that there were nation states, many nation states took that into consideration. Was it worthwhile to start a war when there was trade? And I can remind you that that is one, not the only one, but one of the bases of the funding of the European Union. If we create trade and an internal market and a good economy, then that can be a basis of no more war. And up until now, and touch wood, that sort of worked. It's not always easy in Europe, but it worked up until now. So there's a lot of advantages, a lot of good that came out of trade. But as we all know, it's not only good that comes out of trade. And we see increasingly, and there's an increasing awareness among people, among the public opinion, that the imbalances of trade today, they also create a lot of damage. Although you could say overall it's good for the economy, but at the same time you see a lot of people not benefiting from trade. Think about a lot of people losing their jobs because the goods are being produced in bad social and environmental standards in other parts of the world. Think about all the impact trade has and can have on the way our planet works. So it's important to connect the trade issue with the overall subject that we have today, because the overall subject of the conference is addressing the growth paradigm. That's extremely important to question the growth paradigm that we have today, because it's important to think about how can we dethrone economic growth as we know it today as a ruler of our prosperity, and change the purely quantitative growth, and that connects a lot with the purely quantitative paradigm of trade, into something that is clearly much more into qualitative paradigm of what we could call well-being. And as I mentioned before, trade, the last couple of years, I have to say, became much more higher on the political agenda because of the broad awareness amongst the public opinion, and that's good. That's helpful. Think about the discussions we had on TTIP, the discussions we had on CETA, although voted in this parliament, there's huge discussion amongst it. We also had the declaration of Namur, trying to change that paradigm of trade. We're not yet there at all. Although we had a lot of discussions about how to deal with the environmental and social impact in trade, still if we look to the upcoming trade agreement with Japan, for instance, we can see that, again, the environmental and social standards, they're in chapter, I don't know which one, but they are not, as they should be, ruling the trade agreement. It is soft law, as it always is. So that means it's a little bit sided. At the end, we might take that into account. I think that's all questions for the people here in my and your panel today. Somebody suggested that we should have an empty chair. We have both, but we need one empty chair. I chaired yesterday a panel on sustainable finance, and at least there was a representative of the Commission. Today we didn't succeed in that, and that's a pity, because the leading force in the trade discussions we have today is the Commission. But nevertheless, I have an excellent panel. And before I give the floor to the first speaker, I would like to give the floor to Patrizia Heidegger from the EEB, who is the who's our co-organizer of today, who will say something about that, and also some practical issues that I always tend to forget. Patrizia.
Thank you, Kathleen. So, I would like to welcome you to this session in the name of the European Environmental Bureau. As a co-organizer, the EEB is the largest network of environmental organizations in the EU. Maybe I should just wait 10 seconds? Okay, so we're the largest network of environmental organizations in the EU, and through our membership we represent around 30 million citizens who are organized in the environmental movement in the EU and beyond. We've been working with members of parliament in organizing this important debate on how to move to a post-growth society and economy that can ensure well-being for all and prosperity within the planetary boundaries, and we're very excited to have this debate in the European Parliament. And in particular with this session on trade, which is entitled Trade versus Climate, I'm looking forward to a debate with this diverse panel, not only on how global trade patterns hamper our fight against climate change, but also how it hampers our fight against other environmental impact. So I would like to open up the debate. We focus on climate, but I would like to open it up to other environmental pressures and how we can address these at European level through our trade policies and other related policies. So for us at the EB, this question is of a particular interest. Our members across the EU have come together to work on the transition towards an economy that serves people and planet, and what we need to do to bring it back into the safe operating space. So I'm very much looking forward to this debate and hope to get a lot of new innovative ideas for the future of this debate. One remark on technicalities. So I hope you're all familiar with Slido, an app which we're using today to help us to gather your questions. So if you are here with your computers or smartphones, please go to sly.do. The code is available on the program.
It's T735.
T735. So you use this code to enter on Slido, and you will be able to put questions to the panel, and you can vote on questions. So that helps us to kind of see which are the issues that you find most pressing. And there will be a poll on different statements or ideas, and you're invited to answer to the poll, and we will see how we'll integrate this into the discussion. So please use it.
Thank you very much, Patrizia. And I now give the floor to Fritz Hinterberger, who is the founding president of SERI, which is the study of national economics at Johannes Kepler University, and since 1999, founding president of the Sustainable Europe Research Institute. And Fritz, we will ask you to set first the scene on trade as a metabolism and the physical science behind the trade versus the planetary boundaries, and why do we have a problem? Fritz, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and maybe even some solutions. The trade and CO2 emissions, there was a question posed on the website for these sessions. Will the increase of international freight-related CO2 emissions jeopardize the Paris Climate Agreement? And my answer is maybe astonishingly no. But, of course, trade does have a major influence on the environment and climate, and this is the question, why is that so? I think the most important aspect here is that we are, over the last decades and maybe even centuries, shifted the CO2 intensive activities into the other parts of the world, into the countries of the south or the developing countries, however you want to call them. So the regulations regarding CO2 emissions here in Europe, in industrialized countries, are then associated with more of them in other parts of the world. And this outsourcing processes, we outsource the manufacturing, and with that we outsource CO2 emissions, and we also call that sometimes the carbon leakage. And so what we have to differentiate here is the carbon footprint with the production-based approach. And what we often discuss is what are the CO2 emissions or the greenhouse gas emissions here in Europe or in a specific country that are produced here. Some of them are related with exports, which you then could relate to the consumption in other parts of the world, in other countries where we export to. But what we really should look at is the carbon footprint. That means the consumption-based approach. So for what CO2 emissions are we here in Europe, here in our country, responsible for over the entire value chain. And this is not just the transport emissions, it's all the emissions that occur in those other countries where where this is the products are produced and where they come from. And if you look at that table, then you see some figures on the carbon footprint, where you see that in some countries the carbon footprint or the CO2 footprint here, it's just in this table just the CO2 footprint, not including the methane and the other greenhouse gases. But still there is a similar, that would give a similar picture. Here you have countries in which the carbon footprint is higher, but you also have countries where the carbon footprint is lower. And if you look at this, and if you're into this for some considerable time, you see that these differences have diminished. That means in some countries, some years ago, this difference would have been much lower, but nowadays the Chinese carbon footprint is only, let's say, 10% below the production-based. So that means that they also in their country have already consumed a lot of CO2 emissions. But this is what is really trade-related. How can we reduce the whole CO2 emissions, not just those from the transport? And this is actually the challenge. With 9.5 billion people, with their demand for food, and this then leads to energy, material, land, water, resources demand, and westernized patterns of consumption. This gives this rapid increase for resources in all parts of the world, and also other parts of the world are catching up in this. And this leads to, since especially the land is limited, the land on which renewable resources are produced is limited, this leads to increased prices, this leads to increased poverty, less disposable incomes, and that hits back on economic growth, actually. And we see this in our scenario. I will show in a minute that economic growth is somehow limited, and this is what the Club of Rome told us 50 years ago already, that the increasing demand for resources will limit our possibilities to growth. And that is why I think we should talk about the post-growth economy. The next slide is on Ressourcenwende, and this would be, let's say, the solution. So it's not just technological solutions, new engines. It's, of course, about a rethinking of the whole system. And I call this Ressourcenwende in analogy to the Energiewende, as we call it in German. So the circular economy, if you want, but it's more clear when we talk about the Ressourcenwende to reduce, the reuse, the recycle of materials. That would also reduce the trade-related CO2 emissions, the carbon footprints, and further on, of course, also the transport-related CO2 emissions, and that would lead to for that we need, of course, policy measures that will not come by changes of consumption. So we need the right prices for the products, including the carbon footprint, but of course also for the transport, and abolishing all these direct and indirect subsidies for traffic and also for the resource use. So in the second half of my talk, I would refer you to the next slide, please, right, to some of the scenarios we did in a huge EU project where we compared different scenarios that should lead to common targets, which are 5 tons of raw material consumption per capita in Europe, to reduce the cropland footprint, to reduce the greenhouse gases by 80%, not just the national but also the imported, the carbon footprint. What we show in the next slide is that the business as usual is certainly not an option. According to our calculations, this increasing demand for resources would lead into a world of 4 to 6 degrees. I don't think that this will be actually possible, but of course this will give major distortions to our societies and is by no means sustainable. But the good side is that we came up with 3 alternatives. The first alternative is a global cooperation. This is, let's say, a Paris Agreement world. I do not want to go into further details of that, but show you the second alternative, which is a EU goes ahead scenario, which says what would happen if the rest of the world would not follow, but the EU would do a very serious low-carbon, resource-efficient policy to reorganize our economies, to improve the resource efficiency, to produce comfortable zero-carbon homes, to have a zero-carbon urban transportation, etc., electrification of the energy system, always including the right price signals and eco-labeling, otherwise it would not be possible. And the good sign of that is that this would be economically better than for other countries. So Europe would gain. There's often the fear that we cannot do this because if the other countries won't do this, this would be economically bad for us. No, the contrary is true. This would even give us advantages in terms of growth and certainly jobs. But there is also a third alternative we looked at, and this started from the assumption what happens if policy is not that brave, if we do not get, even in Europe, such a strong resource efficiency and climate policy. In this scenario, we assumed that NGOs, the people, the businesses, take the lead in developing a low-carbon, resource-efficient economy. And this is something that also has been discussed yesterday already. Health, happiness, individual, but also the individual ecological rucksack are key indicators of progress, and people really care for that. And they would consume less but also work less, and they would get their happiness, their health from other sources. They would redistribute their work and their income and look for social and technical innovations that are also outside of the economic, the formal economic sphere. For example, to go for sharing systems, repair, more people living together, and things like that. So, what are the results? In the first place, in the EU goes ahead, a combined Ressourcen- and Energiewende, as we would call it, in the EU would overall benefit for jobs and growth. We would have a 50% increase of GDP. That's about 1%. It's not really much, but it's a bit more than in the business as usual. So it's certainly a go for it. There's no reason to wait for it. With moderate growth rates, with more jobs than in the business as usual. But of course, if you look at the industries, there are, as usually, some sectors that would lose, and of course a major structural change that has to be considered. But on the good side is that all the ecological, the environmental indicators would be reduced considerably, and you could say even not enough, but on the other hand we saw there's economic growth on the other hand, so maybe that we have even more room to maneuver. So the resource material consumption is also going down by more than 50%. The cropland use, which is the land that we use in other parts of the world, would be considerably reduced. So this is environmentally, but also but also economically very favorable scenario. But also the other one, the civil society leads to almost zero growth, 6% until 2050. This is almost nothing, so you could say this is a zero growth scenario. But it could create jobs if the individual people would, on average, work less and give room for others to take these jobs that are left free. Also here we have a considerable reduction in CO2 emissions. The economic consumption per capita would go down to the levels of 1995. I would say, and this can be, of course, discussed, is this a bad thing? But it is not that there is a complete breakdown of the economy. It's a development that is certainly with which we could survive very well, which could increase our well-being even with very low growth rates and reducing considerably the unemployment. What we have here, if we do this just in Europe, it could be that there are shifts to other parts of the world. That means that the CO2 emissions and the resource use that we save here is used up in other parts of the world. So, of course, again, then we are into a global cooperation scenario. But again, we can start, we should start, and this would be could trigger a globally positive effect. On the next slide, I just say that we've also tried this out with a complete phase out of nuclear energy. You maybe know in Austria we celebrate this year the 40 years of a referendum where we opted out of the nuclear energy in Austria, and we calculated what would that mean if all Europe does that, and it would give basically the same results. So also here they are very positive. And then an update of all this will be, and this is my little advertisement of the Growth and Transition Conference as part of the Austrian presidency in November, to which I would like to invite you all to come to Vienna and see a very interesting program. Please go to the website, and also updated figures on the scenarios I just presented to you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fritz. I would like now to switch immediately to Olivier de Schutter, who is a professor at the Catholic University of Leuven. L'Université Catholique de Louvain, sorry, but also a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Olivier, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for this introduction, and let me perhaps start by indeed deploring the fact that the European Commission has not sent a delegate. But I completely understand that this is the case. And let me explain why. And let me take the very concrete example of the European Union-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, the JEFTA, which shall be discussed in the next few weeks here in the European Parliament, since it has been politically approved earlier this year. This is going to concern 600 million people, and it is boasted as a great success, the fact that these negotiations were completed. What shall it mean? It shall mean that the exports of pork, of beef, of dairy products, of processed foods from the EU to Japan shall be stimulated. These are all sectors that are very high emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, and in general, export-led agriculture shall be stimulated as a result of this marvelous result of the negotiations that shall stimulate the exports from the EU. And then the Commission boasts that it has succeeded in negotiating this agreement, thus allowing EU consumers to have access to cheap goods produced at a lower price or for a lower price by Japanese producers. And that it sees as a success, although it will lead, as we all know, to more overconsumption. And the greenhouse gas emissions embedded in the production of those goods that we shall import from Japan shall, of course, not be accounted for in the EU calculations of its greenhouse gas emissions. Those shall be imputed to Japan under the system of calculation that was adopted when the Kyoto Protocol appended to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted, deliberately against the advice of scientists, in order to allow us to maintain our lifestyles, not to change anything, whilst pretending that we are virtuous. Since the Kyoto Protocol entered into force, the EU boasts that it has been reducing its greenhouse gas emissions and that growth is cleaner and less carbon intensive. But in fact, all the progress achieved by the EU on this front, which allows itself to present itself as a champion in combating climate change, is completely nullified by the fact that we've imported ever more from states that are less subjected to certain disciplines, and that allows politicians to say we are making progress without actually using the word sacrifice, changing lifestyles, reducing consumption. Let me perhaps go back to the first slide, if I may. This is what we find in the preamble of the agreement establishing the WTO. As you know, the preamble refers to the expansion of trade in goods and services while, I quote, while allowing for the optimal use of the world's resources in accordance with the objective of sustainable development, seeking both to protect and preserve the environment and to enhance the means for doing so in a manner consistent with their respective needs and concerns at different levels of economic development. Trade is not an end in itself. It's a means towards certain objectives, inter alia sustainable development, and that is how we should read our commitment to trade, including under the WTO agreements. And indeed, there is one case that can be made for trade in support of the environment. There are some arguments that plead for a positive relationship between the two. First of all, trade allows each country, each region to specialize into what it is best at producing according to the law of comparative advantage. And in some cases, yes, some goods may be produced in ways that are more efficient in the use of resources thanks to trade. And it's true that trade can also favor the transfer of technologies, although this should be nuanced because, of course, trade also meant a stronger protection of intellectual property rights, including on green, clean technologies. And it's true that trade means that consumer pressure can be exercised on the companies that dominate world trade, perhaps forcing on them that they adopt some better practices. However, the negative impacts of trade on the environment, in my view, are far more significant. First of all, because trade does encourage more consumption, because the goods, the products that we buy at a lower price from the regions we import from shall encourage an overuse of those goods. And secondly, for the reason that Fritz has mentioned, because of carbon leakage, because it becomes incredibly easy not to do anything to stem overconsumption at home if we can simply import from other countries what is produced according to heavily polluting methods. This picture illustrates the problem of carbon leakage, and it shows how, for example, China exports towards the US, exports towards the EU, goods that are very carbon intensive, in other terms, in which the greenhouse gas emissions per value exported are very high. In comparison, the EU exports are much lower, as the next slide shall show. We see that for a country such as, for example, France, the imports, in the bottom part of this slide, the imports of France are far more carbon intensive than the exports from France, but this is the exact opposite for China, for Russia, of course, exporting gas and petrol, for India, for example. And so trade has actually made it possible for us to pretend we do things without us changing anything. I think it's a problem. And so at the request of a Belgian Minister for Sustainable Development, as he then was in 2015, I wrote a report on what we could do at EU level in order to address this discrepancy, this schizophrenia between pretending to combat climate change on the one hand and searching for trade opportunities on the other hand. Mostly when we speak to politicians, not to you of course, but to governments, they say, no, we can't do anything. This would be against WTO disciplines. We cannot, right? It would be a violation of our trade commitments and our commitment to free trade. Actually, they can do much more than they want to admit. And it's high time that we don't leave these statements unresponded to, and that we look into the actual jurisprudence of the WTO dispute settlement bodies to see what can be done without reneging on our commitments to open, predictable, rules-based trade relationships as they are under the WTO agreements. It is true that it is not always easy to argue in favor of this linkage, but in this report, which is actually in a book form now, Patrizia, you may show this book because this is my gift to EB today, and this is the report in its published form, and I try to explore there what can be done in order to make sure that trade forces our trading partners to improve their environmental standards rather than favoring environmental dumping. It's not easy to do and to argue for, essentially because the conditionalities we may wish to impose for improved environmental standards are linked not to the physical characteristics of the product we import, they are linked to how these products are produced in the exporting country, and because they are expressing a preference for how those products are made in those countries, China, India, whatever, rather than preferences as to how we consume them. But I should nuance this because the preferences that consumers express are recognized by WTO dispute settlement bodies to be a legitimate ground on the basis of which certain environmental conditionalities may be imposed in trade agreements. And believe me, I had many debates with people from the European Commission about their sustainable development chapters they include in trade agreements. And they're happy to do this because, of course, it is not a real strong binding commitment to improve things. But when we speak about environmental conditionalities, that they fear to impose, that they do not want to impose. And they do not see it as their role to use trade as a tool to improve environmental protection worldwide, which is a gross mistake. The EU has a huge market. It represents 21% of global GDP. It can use that enormous muscle it has to force trading partners to improve their standards, and this would support social movements, environmental NGOs, indeed unions across the world in their struggles at local level. And this the EU can do. They could, or it could, link access to markets to environmental standards. It shall be a bit too long for me to go through the 3 tools or 4 tools that can be used. Let me just cite them, and maybe there shall be questions about them. First of all, higher tariffs on the goods that do not comply with certain standards may be allowable under Article 20 of the GATT agreement, which is the, we may shift slides, which is the General Exceptions Clause. Yep, no, thanks. Which very clearly allows states to derogate from the non-discrimination principles of the most favored nation clause and the national treatment clause when this relates to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources, and greenhouse gas emissions are considered to fall under that exception. A second tool that can be used is we may move on to the second tool, sorry, is border tax adjustments. The EU has an emissions trading scheme which essentially may be described as a tax imposed on the heavily polluting industries, and it is perfectly possible for the EU to take this into account by imposing an adjustment on the goods that are imported into the EU and are not subject to similar taxes at home. Now, there are different ways of doing things, of doing this and imposing these border tax adjustments. depending on which criterion we use to assess the tax levels that should be imposed on imported goods in the EU, with pros and cons for each method of calculation. That's a debate we can have, but technically and legally, it is something that can be done. Number three, we could use, of course, the GSP scheme as is already done to encourage trade, to encourage our trading partners from developing countries that want to do more in the fields of human rights, labor rights, and environmental protection to be granted special advantages. Fourth and finally, we may resort to labeling schemes in order to allow consumers to make choices that are well informed about the environmental impacts of the products that they buy. And in fact, if we move on to the next slide, we see that there's a very strong support within the European population in favor of such labeling schemes. Some 72% of the EU public that was polled in 2009 were in favor of being able to make their purchasing choices based on that environmental information. That was 2009. I suspect that percentage would be probably even higher now. So politicians who would have the audacity to say very clearly that trade should become a tool to force positive change worldwide, rather than a tool to achieve growth with the hope that in the future more growth will lead to reducing our ecological footprint, which I think is a contradiction, would be rewarded by the public according to these expectations that have been expressed in these opinion polls. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier. The last point was very intriguing for a politician, of course. Today it seems that only anti-migration politics is working in the public, but we'll keep that in mind. No, I think I strongly believe in what he said. Let me now move to Luisa. In the beginning, it has been said that we should have a representative of DG Trade, and also questions about it. Absolutely, we asked them. But we asked also Business Europe, and we welcome you very much. You will not say the same things as Olivier and Fritz told before. You will have another role to play, but I think in a debate that is extremely important. So thank you very much for being in here, and you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Kathleen. And actually, I'm really happy to be here because I think it is a challenging and very interesting debate. Maybe I would start because the title of today's panel discussion is Trade versus Climate. I don't agree with this. I don't think trade and climate are necessarily working against each other. I think, and I share your views, let's use trade to make a positive change towards climate and environment. We might disagree on the methods to arrive there, and this is a bit what I will try to explain. Well, I think companies are very much perceived sometimes as being against environment or against climate, or that are normally averse to change. I think that this is a wrong concept. Of course, companies are very different around the world, but companies are part of the solution. If you really want to have more technologies to address climate change, new innovative products, you need companies. You need investment. Of course, we don't work alone. We work with universities. We work with researchers. But ideas need to become a practice. They need to go to the market. They need to be applied. And for this, you need companies. So we are part of the solution. It's true sometimes we need to be a bit pushed. This is also how you're driven innovation. You need to have a push from the market. Not necessarily from legislators, or not always from legislators, but definitely from the market, and I think the market is the consumers. So this is not just a dichotomy between business and governments. It's also the consumers and the citizens in general play a role also in this process. Now, how can trade help And I think the previous speakers, or especially Olivier, already mentioned areas where trade can help. Trade can help, of course, if we start favoring the exchanges on environmental goods, on technologies that address climate change. And we had actually that project until last year in the WTO. We were negotiating the EGA, the Environmental Goods Agreement, that was precisely aimed at creating better conditions for goods that are important to address climate change concerns be traded over the world. And this is positive, not just for Europe, but also precisely for the countries that, as Olivier mentioned, have higher, for the moment, are not exactly leading in terms of social or environmental standards. It's important that we exchange technologies. It's important that Europe contributes also with this innovation to make sure that these countries go faster in addressing the same challenges. So, unfortunately, negotiations were stopped, and you all know, I'm not going to give you any news of what is happening right now with WTO. All these ideas on WTO, what WTO can do, are fantastic, but right now we have a more important problem, is to make sure that the WTO remains as an organization, that we continue to have rules that work, that make sure that we have a level playing field. We can question whether these rules can be improved, and this is definitely one of the areas where rules can be improved, but right now we have an existential problem, is to try to keep the system. And this is what we are fighting. So other discussions, unfortunately, for the moment, for instance on EGA, are not on the table. They might come, hopefully, but for the moment, unfortunately, they are not. But definitely, I think in WTO, also bringing more expertise from climate experts to, for instance, WTO rulings could be a welcoming change, also to make sure that when we are discussing on whether some measures on the climate area are or not conform to WTO, it might help to give a different perspective. Then I'll bring here the element of development, because you mentioned, Olivier, also the GSP. The GSP is a scheme that we give that provides developing countries the possibility of exporting duty-free to Europe if they comply with certain conditions, and that's GSP+. But we have other part of GSP that does not take this into account. So we have countries, for instance, like India, that is one of the major polluters worldwide, that is not in GSP+. And we were trying actually to negotiate a free trade agreement with India that contained sustainable development chapters. We can discuss on the level of enforceability, but the idea of having a sustainable development chapter with India is a challenge in itself already. And I can tell you I've been this week in a discussion on India with Indian government officials, and for them they say we can only see this as a very voluntary, a very broad chapter. Because the perception that India and other countries have is, look, you've been developing all over these years without any conditionality. So why are we now, that need still to develop, have to face this conditionality that you, Europe, US, Japan have not had to face in these years? And this is a reasonable argument. Of course, we can say, well, the conditions in the planet have changed. And we need to change the way we produce and the way we consume. But it's not so easy when you say, okay, we are a market of 500 million consumers. We have a lot of leverage. Well, India tells us, well, we have more than 1 billion consumers. Sorry, what is our leverage? So, that's why we believe also as business that we can use trade, and in particular our bilateral trade agreements, because the multilateral also is not working as it should at the moment, to use the bilateral trade agreements to try to get more from these countries. But the reality is we need to be careful on this balance, because if we push too much, we will not get anything. We will not get an agreement, so no commitment, and we cannot also try to promote this change that we want, because we won't want this change. We talk about carbon leakage. We prefer sometimes to talk about investment leakage from from the business side. But the reality is the same, is that if you don't really have the same conditions worldwide, you will always have companies that will be attracted for other markets. This is not necessarily bad in all cases, because of course when we go to these markets, it's not that we force change in regulations, but we can force and we can promote change in procedures as well. And I think it's important that we have this exchange also with these countries if we really want to have a change that is sustainable. I agree with you. Trade should aim at sustainable growth. But sustainable growth also means that the difference between developed countries and developing countries cannot continue to go further. And for this, I think trade still plays a very important role. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Luisa. And now immediately go to Patrizia, 2 women to round up, before we go into the debate and the questions. Patrizia, please.
Thank you. Well, I mean, a lot of things have already been said, and you can imagine that we would agree with a lot of the analysis that Fritz has presented and also a lot of the arguments that Olivier has presented. So maybe I can just stress a couple of points which are important for us. So to tie in with Kathleen's opening statement, we all agree that long-distance trade is part of our human civilization and there's nothing wrong with it. We want to talk about the negative impact that has come with the exponential growth in global trade and the exponential growth of consumption over the, let's say, last 50 years. I think we've heard enough about how the Earth is on the brink of collapse, how environmental disasters nowadays displace more people than war and conflict, how the number of environmental conflicts are on the rise. At the EB, we especially we have a special project focusing on identifying environmental conflicts and how they're often linked to raw materials and commodities that are traded internationally, and how people have benefited very unequally from the prosperity that we have created through international trade. So maybe just to bring in one figure also on the social impact, maybe interesting from an environmental organization, but you're all aware of the figures that are presented every year, the World Economic Forum, Davos, and for the wealth generated in 2017, 82% of all that wealth went to 1% of the global population, whereas the poorer half, so 3.7 billion people, did not progress at all in terms of the wealth and prosperity they have access to. So now we all know that international trade is not the only cause for this dilemma that we are facing, but we all know that it plays a significant role in it. So I would like to make 2 points which tie into what has already been discussed. 2 things I believe that we should focus on when we talk about European trade policies. The first is our trade policies need to focus on how to slow down the metabolism of global material flows. When we talk about trade policies, we never talk about how the trade policy can help us to bring down the absolute use of resources. Our trade policies are exactly about the opposite. Our trade policies and the trade agreements are about boosting the volume of global trade, and this needs to change. Now, we are all aware of the fact that global trade has brought down consumer prices for us. That's the advantage for us, but that's obviously also the trap. The availability of cheaper products has led to a steep rise in consumption, and we are all aware of the fact that the rise in consumption level is a much stronger driver for resource use when compared to the growth of the global population, which is another driver. But our rise of consumption levels is an even stronger driver. So where are we in the EU? We have one of the largest environmental footprints globally, and we use more resources per capita than most of the rest of the world. In fact, we are dependent on the import of resources in terms of weight of imported resources and materials. We have the highest per capita use around the world. So there's also a question of dependency, a question of resilience and sufficiency that we should address, which go beyond environmental concerns only. So again, through the trade policies and all other policies, we should be a front runner in slowing down the metabolism of global economy and in bringing down unsustainable material flow, energy use, and foster the reduction of resource use in absolute terms. So obviously we cannot do that alone, but we need to be a global leader. And I agree with what other people have said, that of course we're not the only ones consuming, and other areas of the world are rapidly developing into major consumer markets, but we are still a key economic power, and this is why I think we can do much more than we have been doing. So in a nutshell, we do not need more trade, we need better trade, and we need trade policies that are fully aligned with the objective of sustainable development, and that goes far beyond the chapters. We have heard about the sustainability chapters, which are difficult to enforce and which just come as a side note to something completely different. So what could be possible instruments that we could be looking into? I think a very first step would be that we come to a much more honest assessment of our global environmental footprint, not only for CO2, but also for water, land use, resource extraction, and emissions, for all the goods that we consume in the EU. So that goes beyond the emissions. And we should use these indicators to measure our progress. So progress would mean reduction of resource use. Just to give you an example, we've had a lot of discussion about SDG monitoring. How do we monitor our progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals? And the 100 indicators that have been proposed to measure progress for the EU do not contain any indicator on our global footprint in terms of resource use, land use, water use, etc., even though this seems to be one of our biggest challenges. So if we don't have the right indicators to measure our progress, we won't get very far. And once we have these kind of indicators, we need to use that to talk about targets for reduction for all these different resources that we use, and we also need to talk about caps for the most critical resources. And of course, there's also a discussion that we have to have at a global level, because again, we all know that we can't solve it on our own. The second point, and we've also already heard about it, is that we also need to be the front runner in promoting strict environmental and social standards globally, and we need to be much more ambitious in setting European standards that can influence how products and services are produced globally. I also do believe, and Olivier has showed us this slide, how international trade can support higher standards, but at the same time how often it is based on the existence of lower standards. And we all know that the phenomenon of sweatshops, the phenomenon of pollution havens, it's still there. I mean, it hasn't changed that much despite all our efforts to work on higher environmental and social standards in the supply chains. So what needs to happen at the European level? I think the EU and the member states can do much more to hold companies accountable throughout the value chain. We have seen very interesting developments in the last years on the development of due diligence regulation at European level in member states, and I think that's something that we have to build on. We have, for instance, seen due diligence regulation for timber, for conflict minerals. We have an inspiring example from France with a very broad due diligence law. We have the Netherlands with a child labour law. We have the UK with the Modern Slavery Act. So we have a lot of different examples that can show us how we can strengthen due diligence in the value chain. And there are a lot of sectors that haven't been touched yet. The textile sector is one of them. Another way forward is that we need the EU and the member states to be very supportive of in the negotiations for a global binding treaty on business and human rights. This has not always been the case, and we believe that the EU can play a much stronger role here. And that should also be something that business should be interested in, because this is about creating a level playing field globally. It's beyond European regulation. And there are many other possible processes where the EU could become a front runner. Just to mention two more, one could be the Global Plastics Protocol, or a global push for the phase-out of hazardous chemicals. So the EU could do much more also at a global level. And that would also help us to kind of put a more realistic price tag to things, and also help to bring down consumption levels globally. I would also like to invite you to have a look at the alternative trade mandate. I think it was already announced. It's part of the description of this discussion, which explains a little bit more in detail what a new vision for European trade policies could look like. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to talk about how we can work and live with less. So while the world exports in 2016 were, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 30 and 50% times bigger than in 1917. We also see that our genuine progress and life satisfaction in the industrialized world since 1917 has hovered around zero. So all of that hasn't really helped us to live better. So this is why we shouldn't be afraid to kind of get into these discussions and to discuss or rediscuss the role that international trade can play to establish human well-being. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patrizia. I'm immediately going to have a look at the different questions, but I would like to open with a more general question to all four panelists to sort of broaden the discussion. The good news today is that if I listen to all of you, at least the basics we say the same. When we say what should be, and it's not so obvious, in the sense that I hear a lot of people just say trade is there for trade, point. And we need a maximum of trade, and that's good, point. A lot of economists still tell that story. I didn't hear that today. Trade is a mean to do something. As Europe, as we always pretend to lead, as, for instance, on human rights and on climate change, we can lead on trade as a means to make a better world. That seems... but then how to do that? And there are different... If I listened carefully to everything that you said, I could sum it up like... overall, that was what Patrizia started with, overall we need less consumption. Because if we keep up the consumption as we have, we are facing a lot of problems in the world with the footprint. Second, we need to make sure that the consumption that we do, the products that we use, that they are more sustainable. So we need a way of making sure that we know what is the footprint of a product and how do we deal with that. Taxation, ETS, things like that. A carbon tax, for instance, would that be for Business Europe an option? Because that would make a real level playing field between ETS in Europe and the products in the rest of the world. Well, for parts of the products I know, but it's a starting point. And then there's the issue of phasing out. In the sense that we are trying now in European Parliament, we will unfortunately not get there, but it's very important that at least we have the discussion, phase out by a certain date, we're talking about 2035, phase out the combustion engine for cars and vans. Make sure that by 2035 you cannot put new cars on the market with a combustion engine. In other parts of the world, they're having that discussion as well. If you do that, then you cannot import all sorts of cars with a combustion engine from the rest of the world. Should we have that sort of discussions on coal, for instance? Other products, not immediately climate-related, but health-related, glyphosates. Is there a possible way just to say, well, we have here a bunch of products, we don't want them anymore, in any case? Seems a third way, or at least something that is complementary with that. And finally, what is, of course, always a big concern is how will this help to create more equality instead of creating more inequalities? And that's always very important. It's very broad, but I would want you to pick one or two out of them and say, look, this should be key. This is what the first thing we need to do, and how. Please, very focused, and then I go to your question, and I can have a look. I go the other way around. Start with Patrizia, and then Luisa, Olivier, and then Fritz.
Yeah. So I believe that, in many instances, we consume not because we need it, but because it's available. So, obviously there's some basic human needs and they need to be covered. That's kind of the discussion about well-being. What do we actually need? But in the wealthier part of the world, many of the things that we consume are things we don't need. We just consume them because global trade, amongst others, make them available to us at a very low price. So the consequence of that for me is that, yes, we need aware consumers, but for me, that comes last. We can't leave it to the consumer. We need other instruments, and I would agree that in certain situations we do need bans. I mean, we cannot ban everything. It's maybe impossible to ban the fact that you can buy half an orange in a supermarket which is wrapped in plastic. Maybe we can ban it, I don't know. But there are things that we can ban. And there are interesting developments. I mean, we do see interesting developments, for instance, in the last year around plastics. We have banned other things. We have banned hazardous chemicals. We have banned certain pesticides. And this has to continue. So, yes, certain things have to phase out. Raising the environmental and social standards, as I've said before, will also help us to kind of give a price tag to things, a more realistic price tag, and that will also bring down consumption levels. But there are other instruments. I mean, there are also instruments of not just raising standards, but also, I mean, literally putting a price tag to things. For instance, through tax. I mean, just to give you one example, why is there no VAT on flight tickets? But why is there VAT on train tickets? Why is kerosene exempted from tax? And why is the train system not exempted from these kind of taxes? So, I mean, also through the tax system, we can do a lot of things. We don't need bans, but just by putting a different price tag, we can also change consumer behavior. So I think we need this mix of all different kind of instruments. We cannot ban everything, but some things probably, it's also symbolic to phase out certain products, such as single-use plastic.
Thank you very much. Luisa, the carbon border tax.
Well, it's a very.
Does everybody know what it is? The carbon border tax.
You do the carbon adjustment via the tax, and you tax products. The question is, what exactly are you taxing? You're taxing products that are coming from countries that supposedly are not following the same level of commitments that you are. The question that we see with that is, first, how are we going to put this? Because this is kind of a duty, a custom duty, and that's why normally it raises the question on whether it's compatible or not with WTO, but this we can discuss. But for me, the big question mark is whether this is fulfilling the objective. And I think the objective here, as you mentioned, Kathleen, is to ensure that we have a level playing field so that we are not doing everything in Europe, but we are faced with imports coming from other countries that are not really doing the same as we are, so that are much cheaper. Will the tax avoid this? I have my doubts, because if we're only doing ourselves, these goods will continue to be there anyway. We will continue to face competition, even if not in the European market. It will continue outside the European market. And the question is, will this not lead, again, to carbon leakage or investment leakage, in the sense that companies might not be able to sell the products here, but will be selling the products and producing somewhere else? So that's why, on top of it, I mean, on the context that we live today of taxes on taxes on taxes, what we are seeing now, and I give you an example, for instance, the U.S. right now is putting additional taxes on imports from China. What is this is leading to a change of China's policies, we will have to see. But what I can tell you is leading already is that you have a number of European companies, for instance, that import semi-products from China to be produced in the U.S., and now what they are doing is sometimes either delocalizing all the production to the U.S., which might be something that Mr. Trump wants, or then simply producing everything in Europe or somewhere else in Asia, but not in China, to avoid the duties. So the question that you have, and I'm giving this example because it's a concrete example, it's not a border adjustment tax, but it is a tax, an additional tax that is already having an impact on supply chains, because simply companies will try to find alternatives. Now the question is, again, I'm not saying completely wrong, but, or an idea that is not subject to discussion, but we see a lot of problems in it. Also because if other countries consider that this measure is not compatible with the WTO, they might retaliate, and we face ourselves with tariffs in there. That's what is happening now, concretely between the US and China. So there are risks, and the question is whether the risks that we take compensate for the objective that we want to achieve with the tax.
That seems that needs some reaction from Olivier.
Okay, thanks very much. There's a lot to be said, but I'll focus on 2 points. One that was mentioned by Patrizia and one that was just mentioned by Luisa Santos. First, I think what Patrizia said is really important, that we should not be allowed to avoid the debate about consumption, lifestyles. And frankly, Kathleen, this is a direct answer to your question, I hope. We should not accept the idea that low-cost stuff is a substitute for social justice. Of course, it's important that, the poorest families can live comfortably in the EU, which has far enough wealth created to support those families. But it's not the right way to do this, to encourage the low-cost economy. My own view is that it's far easier for politicians to continue the direction we've espoused, which is to allow this dumping to take place under the pretext that it provides cheap flights to all households, than to take the bold measures to redistribute wealth more equitably. Right? So I think it's really important, and the discussion on consumption cannot be dissociated from a consumption of social justice, just like what is done excellently by the European Environmental Bureau should be done hand in hand with anti-poverty groups and unions, because the two struggles, I think, should be combined. Otherwise, it's an answer that we will continue to be, forced to give, and it's an alternative that should unite the different parts of the progressive movement. My second comment on border tax adjustment. It's difficult to discuss this without becoming slightly technical, but I personally believe, number one, it is compatible with WTO disciplines. Article 2, paragraph 2A of the GATT agreement explicitly provides for this. But of course, there are different ways of doing this, some of which may encourage our trading partners to raise the bar in order not to have to pay the duty. Others which may not have that positive impact, although in all cases it would protect us from environmental dumping. The key point is, shall it penalize developing countries' right to develop? And here, I think it's a valid question. It was actually a question I saw listed amongst those that we received. My view is that we should only allow ourselves to take such a protectionist measure if, A, the measure is based on universally agreed standards, such as the national commitments under the Paris Agreement, B, if it's subject to independent monitoring rather than unilateral assessment of whether a country complies with its environmental commitments, and number 3, if the money collected, right, if the duties collected at the border support the development of developing countries in order to favor their path towards sustainable development. If we do that, I can assure you it will be impossible to challenge before the WTO. And the WTO dispute settlement bodies, in fact, have given far more flexibility to states to legislate for the public interest than governments usually want to admit. What's striking to me is that many measures are not adopted by the EU and other members of the WTO because they fear that it might run against the disciplines of the WTO, but in most cases, actually, they have more flexibility than they want to admit, and it's a lack of political courage not to explore these alternative routes.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Fritz.
Thank you. I have 3 points. One is more general, that would mean take the environmental and social aspects really serious. It's often discussed as something that we can deal with when we have no water problems. But they are really core, and I think even especially in the political debate, this should come more upfront. The second is on the concrete measures. We should not play out against each other the taxes, the prices, the bans, the labels, the information. We need them all, and we need them fitting together. Just to give one example, I think there is underway a quite good regulation in Europe on the eco-design and the repairability of products and the labels on that. But it is too late. When that comes into force in several years, many of the Austrian, and I believe also in other countries, repair shops will be bankrupt. But that could be bridged. Obviously, this processes take some time, but that could be bridged, for example, by reducing the VAT for repair services in the national legislations, because the repair is not only competing with other services, it's competing with everything that has been said, with the newly produced products that use resources, that use maybe unfair labor conditions, etc., in other countries. So there's an unfair labor field, and if we wait too long, this really nice European eco-design framework could come too late. And my third point is, and I think we've not discussed this yet so much, is the communication, how we talk about this, you said we agree here more or less on many things, but outside this room there is no understanding. And I think it's very simple, but it's really a question how we communicate. And the point here would be, put the well-being at the heart of the discussion. It's not the economy, stupid. It's how we want to live and how we all want to live. Of course, distribution questions come here into the picture, but this is and show, and this is why I find our scenario so important, to show that it is possible to increase the well-being, to have a good life with less economy and trade. If that is so, this is instrumental for what we really need, and this is well-being. And this is a simple story, but it's often not, heard and discussed outside communities like this.
Thank you very much, Fritz. I now go to the questions. I'll come to you immediately, because I also like you to raise some questions, not only on but I'll take first the top. Although the first question I think we tackled, there's the question who. I don't think that's World Health Organization, but that is just who. Do we need to put under pressure now to use WTO rules to put a carbon tariff on imports from the US? I think we heard two answers already to that. The first, and I've heard that before, Olivier, from other people who are specialized in WTO rules, there are no problems if you put it right to take a carbon adjustment tax that's not as such against WTO rules, although it's been used as an argument constantly. What is not a good idea is to take only the US at that part as the one to tackle. Although we are all extremely angry of what's happening in the States and Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement, it's a disgrace. But there are problems also in China and also in India compared to the United States. So you cannot take a carbon adjustment tax or the WTO rules just to take revenge on the US. And there is a poll also, and there's an interesting question because the Commission said they would tax the Harley Davidson, for instance, and that seemed like a good idea. You try to tackle them there in that state where it hurts. But at the same time, well, not at the same time, a few months later, Juncker went to Trump to say, yeah, we'll cool off and we'll make another deal and don't worry, and then we in Europe will take your liquefied gas coming from fracking. I think that is a disgrace. I'd rather have the Harley Davidson, although it's also a combustion engine, but then the gas coming from fracking. So there you see there's not a real framework in Europe that that is a political framework that says, let's prioritize the goods in a good way. Okay, let me now go to the following question, and that is one for you, Olivier. Would a carbon label not punish developing countries where the production is, of course, not so clean? That's the overall question on if you put burden. A lot of parts of the world, Africa, for instance, are not yet ready, don't have the technologies. Would not that hurt their development with all the consequences that it has?
Well, I think in part I already answered this question by saying that whichever measures we take should be complemented with measures in support of developing countries' efforts to shift to sustainable development. But let us not confuse the interests of the governments and the big companies that dominate world trade and export chains with the population. In many developing countries, there are many groups that fight to preserve the resources, that are the hardest hit by environmental disasters, that would want their governments to be more enlightened as to the environmental impacts of the kind of growth model that they are pursuing. And these groups feel they are not supported, whereas the EU could take measures to support them. And just imagine people fighting for the environment in China for clean air, or in India for the preservation of forests, who could be able to approach their governments and say, look, if you do what we recommend that you do, we will have easier access to EU markets, and the consumers in EU will recognize that our efforts are worth rewarding. These people shall be supported if we want to take such a measure. So I would like us to open up the sort of black box or billboard, if you wish, ball of the states. States are not just the governments who represent one fraction of the population. And within these countries, there are very important debates as to which kind of development model they want to pursue. So helping them is sending that kind of message, because for the moment, the message we send is the cheaper you sell, the more we want. We should send a message, the better you produce, and the more the markets will be open.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for... a question for Luisa. Yeah. Leaked documents show Business Europe Group would oppose more ambitious climate goals.
I will answer that. I was actually expecting this question, so... Yeah, because I know it's in the press today. So for those who are not aware, there was an internal document from Business Europe, a working document that was actually sent internally, because we are now having a discussion on what we want in terms of commitments.
It's for 2050?
Exactly. And there is a document, an internal document leaked with 3 options. 3 options. So the options are that we support, that we remain more neutral, or that we oppose. And the news that came out is that we oppose. First, we have not taken any decision yet on what will be our position. That's the first point. The second point is that the document foresees several options. So it's not just one. We are basically in the discussion to see which one we would take as organization. So I don't know which one we will take. So this is not like we will oppose. No, we don't know yet. We are discussing internally whether we will support, because we are talking about basically a proposal to go to 45%, or not. So that's my comment on the leaked document. It's an internal document to start discussions. That's what it is.
For everybody's good understanding, we are in the middle of the Commission will come out somewhere in October with their positioning on the new climate goals for 2050. And so there's a lot of, that's good, and everything you can do to put pressure on the Commission, please do. It's important. It's also important that everybody can speak out. That's what it's all about, and we all hope that the Commission will come up with at least net zero emissions by 2050. Mm-hmm. And I can give you a list of companies that are ready already to support that. So it's not That's, and it's not your fault, Louis, but it's often the problem with an umbrella organization like Business Europe. There are a lot of companies that are willing to go rather, that take ambitious levels, but in an umbrella organization, then you sort of go to the lowest common denominator instead of the highest. So if we can help you to go for the highest, please let us know. We'll send you letters and so on. Yes, you can.
Comment on that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's an umbrella organization, so we represent all European countries. But there is one important point on the level of commitment from the companies. You're totally right. There are companies who can go further and companies can go less. I mean, what we sometimes need to take into account, and this is very much part of our positions, is that we need to take also into account the smaller business. And the smaller business needs some more time in many cases to adjust. And we need to take this into account as well in the level of ambitions in many areas, not just in this one. Thanks.
How can we make companies sell the most sustainable solutions? How to make electricity companies sell energy savings instead of electricity? Who has a good solution for that? Oh, you have. Okay.
From the audience.
Nicholas Ashford. I think everybody understands that if we do not do something serious about over-energy consumption and the wrong kind of energy, we're going to get everybody into trouble. Now, the discussion has been supposed to be related to trade here. First, we have to tax environmentally and global climate damaging technologies in the United States. And by the way, I'll remind you that California, which is 1/6 the sixth largest economy in the world, is prepared to do a combination of regulation and tax, irrespective of what Mr. Trump does. So anyway, at the federal level, if we place a carbon tax on technologies which are clearly inadequate, there is no reason that I see in my analysis of the WTO rules why we can't place that very same tax on the technologies which are being imported by China. And I'm not sure when you say developing countries, whether you're including China as a developing country, because that's where the majority of the exports come. So, I mean, the thing about a tax or a regulation, contrary to public opinion and, industry's perspectives, is that, in fact, it does stimulate innovation. And the rewards to the country happens to do with either the choice of better technologies to import or the development of those technologies. And it is a legend that is total nonsense to say that regulation kills innovation or jobs. So I think you've got to get modern here and understand what the situation really is. A major importer like the United States ought to have a combination of regulations and carbon taxes. And the WTO allows adjustments at the border. I think that was very, very clear. It allows adjustments for environmental issues or worker health and safety issue. What's not being talked about here is the WTO rules do not give the same privilege to unfair labor practices which have to do with working hours and the like. So we can't seem to use the WTO as constructed to have better pressures for better working conditions, not having Chinese women work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. We can't sell it that way. But to the extent that labor is connected with these technologies, we can give labor a better deal. But of course, we have a situation in the White House which could pass in November. This time too will pass, right? It will be part of our history. But the global climate change crisis is upon us now. And we ought to take actions now to do that. And may I reflect on the fact that the inability of the U.S. and Europe to strike the transatlantic trade initiative has to do not with tariffs, but with regulation. So if the Commission is not committed to a carbon tax, to stringent regulation, and will capitulate to the Trumps, then we're lost. But Europe has to stand up. Europe has to cut the umbilical cord politically with the U.S.
You see, the audience, and I think a lot of people here agree with what you said. One of the problems in Europe, in the European Parliament, there's not a big, but there's a majority for that. It's not a big majority, I have to say, but it's there. We can re-establish that if needed. So we did that in the whole discussions we had on ETS. It didn't pass the negotiations with Council and as usual, because as you know, that's one of the difficulties we have in Europe, is that in the Council there's no agreement on taxation policies. That's the reason why we have ETS instead of a carbon tax. It would be so much easier instead of a very complex, nobody understands system like the ETS that is limited to a few sectors because of carbon leakage. It would be so much easier if we would have a carbon tax in Europe, and it would be automatically be applicable to the rest of the world. So it's so much easier. But in Europe, as you know, if we want to change taxation, we need unanimity. That means that every single member state needs to agree, and that makes it always very, very difficult. But we keep on going for that because I completely agree. I think it's one of the things that we urgently need to do. I'm now looking to the audience and then look for questions. Not big speeches, but good focused questions. Thank you.
Yes, hello. My name is Eero Yrikoskinen. I work for Green Budget Europe, which is a think tank based here in Brussels. I would like to continue on what you were just saying, because I fully understand the dilemma that the EU is facing at the moment regarding how to promote fiscal measures if and when the EU has no mandate to do that. But actually, one way to approach that is to start from the national level. Look at concrete measures on how to promote low carbon and circular economy objectives through different kinds of resource and environmental taxes on the one hand, and on the other hand by reducing or suggesting to reduce labour taxes in a similar way, so that there would be a fiscal neutrality, but through that exercise and through economic modelling you can actually estimate what are the fiscal returns that this would provide at a national level, what kind of labour impacts it would have, and of course what kind of environmental impacts it would have. It's the only way to get forward, because otherwise you are just at a very theoretical level, which is not enough. It is simply not enough for the political decision makers. They need to have concrete figures which provide some kind of ground and basis for further discussions. So this is actually something that we are doing at the moment in the case of Finland, together with two other organizations. So we have done this kind of national exercise. We're in the process of finalizing those estimates. We have been in direct contact with local industry groups and ministries to also get their feedback. Of course, you know, we are not the ones that have all the knowledge, so we need to understand maybe those aspects that we have not taken into consideration properly, and then readjust some of the proposals and go ahead and present the results to the Finnish audience. This could be one way to do it, but you know, you just simply need to do the economic modeling. Otherwise, politicians are not convinced. They are afraid of the current trade balance. They are afraid of the consequences that these measures could have at a national level. But once they get the figures, once they understand that actually through some of these fiscal measures which would reduce CO2 emissions, improve resource efficiency, and on the other hand reduce labour taxes, they are definitely in the winning side. So you need to get to the concrete level in order to be able to advance. Thank you.
Does anybody want to respond to that? Yeah.
Mr. Koskiniemi, hasn't this been done by Sweden with some degree of success, this shift? And both in Sweden the experiment that has been led since about 10 years now. And in your model in Finland, how is trade influencing this debate? And do economic actors fear environmental dumping as a result of the higher taxes on polluting technologies?
Well, actually, that's...
Panel is now asking questions to the audience. You're aware, huh?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, that's a case in point, because obviously this is one of the first reactions that we get from the industry. These measures should be promoted simultaneously at a EU level as well. But, you know, through a first exercise at a national level, whereby you would get a concrete idea how to proceed, you might want to do a similar exercise in other member states that are like-minded, that are prepared to maybe move forward in that direction. And once you get, let's say, at least enhanced cooperation, you know, the minimum number of 9 member states to do something similar together, then you might be able to actually move forward. But it's absolutely true, and it's a very relevant comment that you just made, that without taking into account properly the trade impacts that these measures might have, you're not going to be able to get forward. So there has to be, let's say, critical mass of member states doing the same kind of exercise at the same time. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
Yes, and to make the connection with the overall goal of the conference again, the post-growth and the paradigma on the post-growth. There's a lot of things that we need to change, and one of them is the European semester. As long as we have the European semester and the way we look at it, that means that the Commission looks at the different member states and looks, oh, are you okay with the budgetary rules? And it's only based on these issues, and it's not based on climate, and it's not based on the sustainable development goals. And if you can change that, you get another paradigm coming from the Commission to the member states to at least support that sort of transitional ideas and calculations. So I think it all connects to each other. We need to change the overall paradigm of the GDP, of the European semester, things like that. Are there other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. Mladen Domazet from Institute for Political Ecology in Croatia. In lieu of getting to conclusions of the conference, I'd like to hear from the panel who or what they think stands in the way of introduction of a meaningful carbon tax in 2020, proceeds of which would be used for both development of basic public services for those who need it in Europe and likewise internationally for those who would be affected by that. Thank you.
Maybe an easy answer is, of course, there are those, and I showed this in my slide, that there are always some industries that would be losers, and they understand that they are losers and they are fighting against. So, of course, with that, there needs to be somehow dealt with. But what is on the other side, we have in the political process, we have parties who manage to say we don't want new taxes, and regardless which ones. And obviously, it's not. We did not succeed so far to convince, let's say, the public. Budget Europe is working on this for decades now. To convince people that the first place is we want to reduce the labor tax. And then we could also turn it the other way around. And then we need something in exchange, and why not taxing carbon? So I think besides of this, let's say the usual aspects, it's a question to us, and it's a question to the let's say the media and all this, and then also to the politicians who are very afraid of imposing new taxes, because there is this general atmosphere that taxes are bad. This is another thing, by the way. Taxes are good if we do good services with them. So we need to turn around this debate. And thanks to your question, of course, economic modeling is one of the aspects, one of the tools to use that and to show. And this has shown by us and others hundreds of times, and this is so much from clear. So it's but maybe what could be done more is that we work on this not just in research studies but more with the actual politicians to model their suggestions. It has also a learning effect. Sometimes the effects are a bit different as one would expect, and to learn together how these tax schemes could be applied that at least let's say those behind those politicians who want to favor that are affected in a positive way, and deal with those who are on the loser side.
I think your question was about the carbon tax adjustment at the borders of the EU. Is that correct? Yeah.
The goods and services produced and duty on the ones imported, yeah.
Right.
A radical option, 2020, responding to the climate pressure.
Right. No, I think one major problem is that politicians in charge of those issues focused over the past 10 years on the financial and economic crisis, and these issues are seen as almost, if I may express myself thus in this audience, almost luxury items on the menu that can wait for better times, right? And I think as long as we do not see the connection between protecting poor households from high prices by strong social redistributive policies and environmental measures of that sort that will have impact on consumers, it shall be very difficult to make progress. And this is why I believe that the comments by Kathleen van Brempt on the need, for example, in the European semester, to take that as a whole, right, as a framework that should combine a concern for social justice, for the redistribution of work, and for environmental sustainability is extremely important. But for the moment, I see these proposals as falling on deaf ears because the urgency, we are told, is jobs, jobs, jobs.
Yeah, I can only build on what Fritz and Olivier have just said, and it's something that we're concerned about at the EB as well. I mean, what we lack is that kind of bigger picture, positive narrative provided also by the political leadership. If the political leadership continues to talk about jobs and growth and talks about tax as something potentially negative or dangerous, we will not get a point where it will be easy to pass such kind of social or regulative innovations. So something that we need to focus much more on is to kind of together work, and Olivier rightly said that, for instance, the environmental movement has to team up much more with the social movement to show that it's not kind of, let's say, we're not competing with each other. And sustainable development is exactly about that. I mean, to show how we kind of bring the different dimensions together. But that's something that we have to kind of do much more. And there's also a question of communication and where we need a political leadership that communicates what sustainable development is all about. And if we have a European Union that doesn't even have a strategy on how to implement or get to sustainable development, how do we expect people out there to kind of see that bigger picture? So I think that's something that we will continue working on with a new commission, which will hopefully be more open to kind of put sustainable development really at center stage of all its policies. And there was one question, whether we should do that through trade agreements or whether we should have kind of different human rights instruments or due diligence instruments. Well, it doesn't really, it's not the question if it's inside or outside trade policies. It's about aligning policies so that all the policies kind of go in the same direction. So at the moment, we don't have policy coherence for sustainable development. We have trade policy doing one thing, and then we have, trying to, impose some environmental or social standards through a due diligence regulation, and we have an agricultural policy that does yet another thing. But what we need is coherence for sustainable development, and to communicate about the positive effects that could have on the environment and on us as a society.
Well, I'll actually take up what Patrizia said. When we're talking about coherence in policies, it's definitely something we agree. And if it goes for sustainable development, it also go for, in the case of industry, we need an industrial policy, meaning that we need to take also into account the impact of all policies have on the competitiveness of European business, because I think that's important. Of course, it's all about, when we talk about an economic model or paradigm, we're always talking about jobs and growth. The reality is, and because we are heading for new elections also in Europe, is that in some countries, jobs and growth remain top priority. Must not forget. I mean, there is a lot of difference in Europe as well on this. And the risk that we have is that we have, of course, different voices in different countries, and some of these people that don't have a job and want a job can become much more extremists, and this is something we don't want. So the narrative indeed needs to be different in a way, and that's why I mentioned in my initial presentation that this needs to be perceived by the consumers as well as their effort, because if you really want to change the paradigm as well, it will not come only from regulations. It's one of the things people are complaining about Europe, precisely, is that Europe is over-regulating. If you go and speak to the people in the countries around Europe, we see Europe as over-regulated. So we need to explain also what is behind these regulations and why they are important for people. If we just put regulations there that are not perceived as having a positive impact on day-to-day life of people, we can continue to do so, but we will have a clash also with the reality on the ground. And I'm not saying this because companies don't want to comply with regulations. I'm saying this because you really need to make the workers, the consumers understand the benefits of these regulations if you really want to have a transformative change. Now, on the border tax, and you wanted goods, every goods that are imported. Again, this would mean increased costs for consumers. They should need to be prepared to pay more. Are they prepared to pay more? And are we going to pay more while others are not going to pay more? So that's the question here. And I will not enter again in the remarks I made in the beginning is, of course, how much this is going to solve the bigger problem that we have, and it's not only in Europe, is everywhere. I mean, I'm not saying that we should not look for a solution, definitely. I just have my doubts on whether a tax adjustment at the border is going to be a solution for this.
Just to clarify, and then I'll come back to you, but just to clarify, Luisa, this is much more about a level playing field and justice and applying to climate rules than anything else. And that's why I do not understand, if I talk to people in the chemical industry or the steel industry in Europe that are not having easy times, especially the steel industry, who have to comply to ETS rules, and that's not the case for all the steel that we import in Europe. How can Business Europe defend that model? That is a completely unsustainable model. You need to have a carbon adjustment tax on steel coming in from other parts of the world where they use other and much less ambitious rules on climate and also on other rules, of course. I do not understand why Business Europe doesn't say, yes, there we need a level playing field. It's so obvious.
Again, my question will be, what will be the reaction of other countries? So I'm not saying we are ready to discuss this point. What we have not seen yet is a model that ensures that the final result will be enough to cover the risks. And the risks that we face with this approach is, again, that I think it was Fritz who said there will be some losers. And we don't know, and I don't want to enter in a bilateral discussion between us. We can have it afterwards. I haven't understood, nobody explained to me yet whether there will not be a risk of retaliation from other countries. And this is, in the current context where we are, again, I repeat, we have a situation we don't have functioning rules internationally at the moment. We have a risk that the WTO will not be able to function anymore, meaning that we can have a situation where every country decides to do what he wants. So you put a tax, I put a tax. Look what the US is doing, what China are doing. So this is the reality we are living. I'm not saying it will happen, but there is a risk.
If I may, I would like to add one contribution to this debate, which may be a bit overlooked, which is the question of democracy, accountability, transparency. I presented actually within the WTO Committee of Agriculture a few times my views on trade in food, because I was for a few years for the UN in charge of the right to food. And what was really striking to me is that the positions adopted by diplomats within the WTO were very different from those that in their respective capitals the governments were having inter alia on the future of agriculture and food. And I was struck by the fact that these diplomats had a vested interest in the negotiations within WTO succeeding, because they had put so many efforts into that success becoming reality, and because they had built links between them and so on. I suspect, with great respect for the colleagues from DG Trade, that unfortunately they've developed an idea about trade that more is necessarily better, that opening up export opportunities for European companies, even though it's not the small, middle-sized enterprises, it's the large companies that shall benefit. And even though it may hurt actually the small and middle-sized business enterprises, that is a good thing because that is their mandate. If we opened up the discussions about trade to a wider spectrum of sensitivities, if we made them more open, not necessarily even to civil society, but at least to other DGs, we may have a very different approach to trade negotiations. But my fear is that these diplomats simply do not want to provoke other trading partners. They fear retaliation. Yes, they want trade to succeed because that is what their mandate is about. So I think the question of democracy, accountability, and who is actually going to control the way the positions of the EU are defined is something we should not lose sight of. In fact, we might say that the EU is a democratic entity except for that particular segment because of the secrecy that surrounds trade negotiations, even though efforts have been made in this area in recent years. It remains very difficult to change that approach and to be much more transparent about the mandate that they have.
Hi everyone, I'm Eva from Germany, and I'm just here because of being interested in the topic of sustainability. Thank you for all the topics you came up with, but I was hoping to get some more into everyday life, or having getting some new ideas for where to take action right now. So I was thinking when this topic came up with consumption, and that we can reduce emissions by just changing the consumption level of today. So what do you think about supporting local productions when it comes to that? For example, vegetables are being shipped through whole Europe, or that strawberries are available in winter. So are there any plans supporting this idea that local economy is more supported? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a similar or a question that connects to that about the tomatoes. It's a little bit the same. Sometimes we just export tomatoes. No. But it's connected to you put it more positively. How can we support local production when cheap tomatoes are coming from Spain, and they're it's much cheaper to produce them over there and to transport them to Belgium, and the other way around. Or we have all these sort of examples. How do we deal with that? It's a very precise and focused question on how do we support the local production against the big commercial interests, especially in the food chain. Yes, please.
I mean, again, I think the answers are similar. One is, of course, you should do that. All the consumers should do that. Convince others. But then there are so many whom we would not reach. And for that, a wise combination of taxes, bans, and information policies would be needed. So and if you say what is your personal action, you could lobby for that. You could convince the others to be for environmental taxes on that. But just to give you an example, of course the vegetables are important. I'm currently working on how pork is produced in Europe and the soy, where does the soy come from? And this is very much of this is imported. That means it's genetically modified. It means that it is destroying rainforests in Brazil, etc. And if we did a calculation, how much would it cost to do the whole Austrian pork production on European soy, which is not genetically modified, where it's not destroying rainforests, that would be €5 per Austrian. So that's definitely not much. On the other hand, some hair-raising taxes of some, let's say, 50 million euros is much in budgetary debates that we are having. And then come the others and say, well, we would need that for our purposes. But this is a political debate that needs to be waged. The arguments are there, and we need to be strong enough and brave enough to fight them. And again, it's obviously not enough to say, well, we save, this is what I hear in election campaigns, that let's say from the Green side it said, well, we save the climate. And therefore we don't get enough votes. We need to say we want to improve the quality of life, your quality of life, and tell the story and explain that in this more general sense, have the economic models that show that we are creating jobs. Growth is not creating jobs, is not creating well-being. This is all what we discuss here. And we need to convince those who are actually the winners, because of course there is a risk of some losers. For these carbon taxes, for example, to take this example again. But what with all the winners? We deprive all the winners of the gains they can have, because all the studies show that in general we are better off. But obviously those who lose are louder, so we need to give the voice to those and raise the voice of those who are the winners. This is you, and this is the small businesses. I don't believe that the small businesses are the losers. Maybe the small businesses are more flexible, and they can change, but they obviously do not have the power. I'm happy that I think in the final panel we will have someone from the Small Businesses Association, so we should ask him about this.
The example that you have mentioned is, of course, a problem of, let's say, internal trade. I mean, let's say if we look at Netherlands and Spain and tomatoes going back and forth. At the moment, we're also reviewing the common agricultural policy in the EU. And I mean, to summarize it, or to oversimplify things maybe, so far the system was the more land you have to farm on, the more money you get, and the system of subsidies was not meant to really support small-scale farming, but led to a trend of like bigger and bigger farming, and also didn't kind of really provide an incentive for small-scale farmers, I mean, to provide them with a decent livelihood, and also didn't really incentivize enough farmers to go into more sustainable methods of production. So, I mean, now we have a chance to rectify this and to actually shift the subsidies from the large-scale production to smaller scale, local production, sustainable production. Small producers also need channels through which they can market and offer their products. So I think there's a lot that can still be done also through the common agricultural policy to rectify that. But then we've also heard about, for instance, JEFTA and international trade in agricultural products. Do we really need to export pork to Japan? I mean, in the EU, we already have too much livestock. We're already polluting our groundwater with nitrate. So do we need trade agreements that actually push us to even produce more of these harmful products? I don't think so. So I think there's different solutions for like the internal market and export. But there was one question whether trade agreements shouldn't we negotiate fair trade agreements? Well, all the trade agreements should be fair trade agreements, and they should all be based on the kind of commitments and the obligations that we already have under the Agenda 2030 and other international agreements, and they should not kind of help us to produce more for export of the things that we already have enough of, or too much of in the EU.
For me, the nub of the problem is the following, that it's being used as an assumption and a cruel blackmailing method against the authorities to argue that if we don't continue the present industrial production system, there will be very serious social losers. This is a fallacy. First of all, the present industrial system privileges certain classes of people and privileges the highly concentrated economically elite. There is no reason why that privileged, distorted, non-free industrial system should continue. And we know how to reward the innovations. We know how. Right now, industry has already changed from giving 50% of the profits to labor to 33% of the labor. Any more industrial production unchanged is simply going to require an enormous amount of production to increase the benefits to workers. And we know this from the work of Autor and other economists at MIT. And I think you have to abandon the present industrial production method, not abandon growth. I'm not someone who says, let's just have degrowth. That is so unhelpful. We need selected growth. We need decreased growth in some areas. We need increased growth in others. And we need transfers to the very poor who are not going to be able to afford some of the essential goods that are going to be subject to the taxes and the regulation. All of this requires simply a comprehensive relook at the industrial production system, its implication for labor, its implication for people, its implication for trade, rather than tinkering at the margins, change trade here, change in environmental regulation there. You've got to attack the basis upon which this pseudo-efficient industrial product system and provision of services exist. And I'm not arguing for socialism, and I'm not arguing for capitalism. I'm arguing to remove the privilege that the present industrial system has delivered and continues to blackmail the authorities.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes, Jounen Nissinen from the European Environmental Bureau. I just wanted to remind you, this is a bit late to the discussion because it took me time to find the most recent Eurobarometer surveys, but when we talk about regulation and the acceptance of regulation, I just wanted to remind you that there is one trend which remains year after year in the Eurobarometer surveys, and that is the trend that European citizens want the EU to take action in environmental protection and make sure that there is enough environmental regulation. And also in these surveys, the European citizens are also in the opinion that the EU should help other countries, non-EU countries, to improve their environmental legislation. So if we talk about border adjustment tax, for instance, there is clearly a strong support from the EU citizens to take action in this issue. And as we know, we don't know exactly how the WTO would react to that. So it might well be acceptable within the WTO context. So clearly, that would be one tool to try.
Absolutely. Anybody wants to comment on that?
I just comment, if I can, on the number of issues. Well, I don't feel privileged if I'm representing the industrial model in Europe, because of course there's a lot of difference between the Europe and US. We have completely different systems in terms of industry as well as social systems. So we shouldn't compare, and we shouldn't compare what European industry is contributing, namely in terms of environment and what the US is doing. But I will not enter there. I'm just going to mention the question of SMEs and the benefits of SMEs, because I think this is a recurrent issue, is that trade is benefiting big companies and not small and medium-sized companies. My background, I'm Portuguese, and I used to work for textiles, so it's a sector I know very well. In Portugal, 90% of companies on the textile sector are SMEs. Mm. They export, Portugal is a small country, huh? They export more than 80% of the production outside Portugal. You tell me mainly Europe, yes, but our second market is the US. And I will tell you, when I export clothing to the US or fabric, sometimes I have to pay 18% duty. If the US exports to Europe, they pay 12%. You think it's fair? You think it's beneficial for SMEs? I don't. So that's why, I mean, trade agreements, I'm just citing the case of the US. I could cite other cases. I could cite China. So, I mean, big companies, yes, of course they benefit. I'm not saying they don't benefit. But a big company can go there and produce. A small company cannot afford simply to go, especially a textile company, where sometimes you have investments of around 30 million, 40 million euros, and it's a small one, huh? To go and do this in the US or in China. So that's why trade agreements are important. I'm not saying big companies don't benefit, but don't forget that smaller ones are the ones who have to export, who have to face tariffs when they want to develop their business. So that's why we need to consider this in trade agreements as well.
Well, thanks. I would like to react just to the question of border tax adjustments and comment that we're actually mixing two conversations. One is the negotiation by the EU of new trade agreements with trading partners and what leverage the EU may exercise to impose certain conditions, which is one important discussion. The other is which measures can the EU unilaterally take under the general WTO disciplines in its trade policies, and this is distinct from the negotiation, of course, of trade agreements. I just think it's important because these are two very different, of course, circumstances and sets of tools. Now, as regards the compatibility with the GATT agreement as part of the WTO agreements of border tax adjustment measures, I agree there is a debate we can have on this, but let us not forget that the WTO agreements are not directly enforceable. I mean by this, if there's no complaint against the country, in other terms, if one WTO member takes a measure and no WTO member seeks consultations, the measure stays in place. And it's a matter of diplomatic negotiation, right, whether such a complaint shall be filed. That is, by the way, why the Court of Justice of the EU does not consider the WTO agreements to be directly applicable in the EU legal order. And so the question to us as Europeans is, should we encourage the EU to take these unilateral measures accompanied by the right incentive, including technology transfers, support to sustainable development in the states from which it imports, and reference to international standards that all countries have pledged to adhere to? Can we give a mandate to the EU diplomats, or to the rather to those setting trade policies, to adopt such unilateral measures? That is the question. And it is only if there is then a complaint filed by the trading partners that the issue of legality under WTO rules shall be raised. I'm relatively confident, but I do agree it all depends how it is done, but it can be done.
Okay, thank you. I think we're coming. No, I don't think. I know we're coming to the end of this workshop. Patrizia is going to read us, because I cannot, although I have my glasses on, I cannot see it. The results of the poll.
Okay, so there was one question or one statement saying Trump started a trade war with the EU. The EU should react with. So we have 82% of our audience saying that building a carbon tariff wall between the US and the EU using WTO rules. 24% of people saying ignore him. 12% want the tax on the Harley-Davidson motorbike imports to the EU, and I may say, luckily, 0% said making liquefied fracked gas imports to the EU easier. Maybe that's a message we should send to the President of the Commission in that case. Then there was another statement saying trade stands between extraction and consumption. To deal with overconsumption, we need two. And then we have 3/4 of the audience here saying use trade agreements to raise social and environmental standards globally and tax polluting production. We have 42% saying be stricter on what can come on the market and what can't, like banning inefficient appliances and products that are designed to fail. And we have 0% saying do nothing, consumer is king, so the cheaper we can get stuff due to trade, the better. And did we have a third one? No, that's it.
Good. Okay, I think it's time to close this workshop and prepare for the closing session of this overall event. And I want to thank, first of all, you for not just listening, but being active participants in this workshop. I thought it was really interesting with questions and comment and small speeches. And of course, my panelists with very focused and clear messages. I think we all learned something. Okay, and see you in the closing session. Thank you very much.